The phone rang that Tuesday morning, and I knew something was wrong even before I answered. It wasn't the usual ringtone I'd grown used to hearing during work hours. It was sharper, more urgent. At the time, I was sitting in yet another meeting, juggling spreadsheets and zoning permits like any other day as mayor of our small town. But this call felt different. My heart sank as I picked up the phone and heard my mom's voice on the other end. "Sweetheart," she said, her tone shaky. They tore it down. For a moment, I thought she meant something minor, like the old shed out back, or maybe one of her flower beds. But no. As she spoke, the truth hit me like a punch to the gut. They had demolished her house, the cozy little home where I grew up, the place filled with memories of laughter, birthdays, holidays, and countless quiet evenings spent talking over cups of tea. Gone. Just like that. All that remained was rubble and dirt. They said it was for the HOA. Mom continued, her voice cracking under the weight of what had happened. For a parking lot. A parking lot. The words echoed in my mind, leaving me stunned. How could anyone justify tearing down an entire house, my mom's home, for something as trivial as a parking lot? She didn't even have time to pack her belongings, her cherished photo albums, the handmade quilt Dad gave her years ago, the little trinkets she collected over decades. They were all gone, lost forever beneath the wrecking ball. I clenched my fists so tightly under the table that my nails dug into my palms. Whoever these people were, whoever thought they had the right to destroy someone's life like this, they were about to regret it. Because I wasn't just some random person calling to complain. I was the mayor. And nobody messed with my family without facing consequences. As soon as the meeting ended, I rushed to my car and sped toward Brookwood Estates, the gated community Mom had moved into 5 years earlier after Dad passed away. The drive felt surreal, anger bubbling inside me with every mile. When I finally arrived, the sight stopped me in my tracks. Where her modest ranch-style house once stood, there was nothing but dirt, a barren patch of land surrounded by orange construction cones. Heavy machinery loomed nearby, ready to pave paradise and put up their precious parking lot. Neighbors watched from their porches, their faces blank, avoiding eye contact, as if they were either ashamed or too scared to speak up. Mom sat alone on a folding chair beside what used to be her driveway, clutching an old photo album to her chest. Her eyes were red and swollen, her posture defeated. Seeing her like that broke something inside me. I parked the car, got out, and walked over to her. Kneeling beside her, I took her frail hand in mine. "Who did this?" I asked, though deep down I already suspected the answer. The and when she whispered the name Mr. Grayson, the president of the association, my blood boiled. This wasn't just negligence, it was cruelty. Someone had decided my mom's home wasn't worth preserving, and I was determined to find out why, and make them pay. By the time I reached Brookwood Estates, my mind was racing with questions. Who exactly was this Mr. Grayson? What kind of person could justify demolishing an elderly woman's home for something as trivial as a parking lot? And how had no one stepped in to stop it? The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. But anger wouldn't solve anything. Not yet, anyway. First, I needed answers. When I arrived at Mom's former house, or what was left of it, I barely recognized the place. The once familiar driveway was now just a stretch of dirt and gravel, littered with construction debris. Orange cones marked off the area like some sort of crime scene. It was a crime scene. In a way, a crime against humanity. Nearby, massive bulldozers sat idle, their metal teeth gleaming menacingly under the sun. They looked like monsters waiting to devour whatever remained of Mom's life. Mom was still sitting on her folding chair, staring blankly at the destruction around her. She held her photo album tightly, as if it were the last tangible piece of her old life. Her hands trembled slightly, and her eyes were distant, lost in memories she couldn't retrieve. Seeing her like that broke my heart all over again. This wasn't just about bricks and mortar. It was about dignity, respect, and the right to live without fear of being tossed aside like garbage. I knelt beside her and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "Mom," I said softly, "tell me everything. What happened?" She hesitated, gathering her thoughts before speaking. "It started last week," she began, her voice trembling. "A man came to the door. Mr. Grayson, he called himself. He was very polite at first, but there was something off about him. He handed me papers, said they needed the land for community development. A parking lot, he claimed. When I told him I didn't want to leave, he just smiled and said it wasn't really my choice." Her words sent a chill down my spine. Not her choice. How could that be possible? She owned the house outright. It wasn't rented, and she certainly hadn't signed away her rights to anyone. Or so I thought. "He kept talking about rules and agreements," Mom continued. "Said I agreed to them when I moved in. I didn't understand half of what he was saying, but he made it clear that if I didn't cooperate, they'd find a way to make me leave anyway. Then yesterday morning, I woke up to the sound of machines. By the time I got outside, it was too late. They were already tearing it down." Tears welled up in her eyes as she spoke, and I felt my own throat tighten. Whoever this Mr. Grayson was, he wasn't just a faceless bureaucrat. He was a predator, preying on someone who couldn't fight back. Someone like my mom. "Did you keep the papers he gave you?" I asked, trying to stay calm despite the rage simmering inside me. She nodded and pointed to a small stack of documents tucked inside her bag. I flipped through them quickly, scanning the fine print. Sure enough, buried in legal jargon was a clause granting the HOA sweeping powers over property usage, including the ability to seize land for community improvement projects. The language was vague enough to mean almost anything, and it was clear they'd exploited it to its fullest extent. "This isn't right," I muttered, clenching the papers in my hand. "They can't just do this." Mom sighed heavily, her shoulders sagging under the weight of everything she'd lost. I tried to argue, "Sweetheart, I really did, but what could I do? They have lawyers, connections, money. All I had was my home, and now it's gone." I wanted to scream, to march straight to the HOA office and demand justice then and there, but I knew better. Acting out of pure emotion wouldn't help Mom, or anyone else caught in this nightmare. If I wanted to fix this, I needed a plan, and I needed proof. As we sat together amidst the wreckage of her life, I promised her one thing. "We're going to fight this, Mom. Whatever it takes, we'll make them pay for what they've done." For the first time since the demolition, a flicker of hope appeared in her eyes. Small, but enough to remind me why I couldn't give up. Not now, not ever. The next morning, I woke up with a clear mission in mind. Confront Mr. Grayson and get answers. This wasn't just about Mom anymore. It was about exposing the truth behind Brookwood Estates' so-called community development. If they thought they could push people around without consequences, they were about to learn otherwise. I drove straight to the Brookwood Estates clubhouse, a grand building that looked more like a luxury resort than a neighborhood meeting hall. Polished marble floors gleamed beneath chandeliers, and framed photos of smiling residents lined the walls. Everything about it screamed perfection. But I knew better. Beneath the shiny surface, there was rot, corruption, greed, and I was determined to dig it out. As I approached the front desk, a young receptionist greeted me with a practiced smile. "Good morning. How can I assist you today?" "I'm here to see Mr. Grayson," I replied firmly. "It's urgent." Her smile faltered slightly, but she nodded and picked up the phone. After a brief conversation, she turned back to me. "Mr. Grayson will see you shortly. Please have a seat." I sat down on one of the plush couches, my hands clenched tightly in my lap. Every second felt like an eternity. Finally, a tall man in an expensive suit emerged from a side door. His face was calm, his expression polished, but there was something cold in his eyes, something calculating. "Mayor Thompson," he exclaimed, extending a hand. "What brings you here?" I ignored his gesture and cut straight to the point. You demolished my mother's home yesterday. Care to explain why? His smile wavered for a split second, but he recovered quickly. Ah, yes. Mrs. Thompson's property. Unfortunately, it was necessary for the greater good of the community. We're expanding facilities to accommodate growing needs. The asterisk greater good asterisk. I repeated, incredulous. You destroyed a woman's home without giving her time to relocate. Where's the humanity in that? Grayson shifted uncomfortably, glancing at his assistant, who hovered nervously nearby. We followed proper procedures, he insisted. All homeowners sign agreements upon moving in. Your mother understood the risks. Risks. Risks of having her roof ripped off her head, of losing everything she owned. I leaned closer, lowering my voice to a dangerous whisper. Let me make one thing clear, Mr. Grayson. You picked the wrong family to mess with. As mayor, I have access to resources you can't imagine. If you think this ends here, you're sorely mistaken. For the first time, doubt flickered in his eyes. Good. Let him sweat. But Grayson wasn't done yet. He straightened his posture, attempting to regain control of the situation. Mayor Thompson, I assure you, this decision wasn't made lightly. The HOA operates within strict guidelines designed to benefit everyone. Sometimes, sacrifices must be made for the collective well-being. Sacrifices? I shot back. Is that what you call stealing someone's home? Because I call it theft. Plain and simple. He opened his mouth to respond, but I didn't give him the chance. You say you followed proper procedures. Fine. Show me the paperwork. Prove to me that what you did was legal and ethical. Or are you hiding behind loopholes because you know deep down this is wrong? Grayson hesitated, clearly unprepared for such direct confrontation. For all his polished speeches and rehearsed charm, he wasn't used to being challenged. Especially not by someone with power. Someone like me. Very well, he said finally, forcing a tight smile. If you'd like to review the documents, my assistant will provide them. But I assure you, everything we've done is above board. I stared at him, letting the silence stretch between us. Above board? Hardly. But I didn't argue further, not yet. Instead, I accepted the stack of papers he handed over and left the clubhouse, my mind racing. Back in my car, I flipped through the documents, searching for clues. Each page was filled with dense legal jargon, but one thing stood out. Vague language granting the HOA nearly unlimited authority over private property. It was cleverly worded, designed to deceive homeowners into signing away their rights without realizing it. This wasn't just about Mom's house. It was about control, power, money. And I was going to expose every dirty secret hidden in those pages. As I drove away from Brookwood Estates, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. Grayson might think he held all the cards, but he underestimated one crucial factor. I wasn't just anyone. I was the mayor. And I wasn't afraid to fight dirty if it meant protecting my family. Back at City Hall, I pored over the documents Grayson had given me, determined to uncover the truth. At first glance, they seemed like standard HOA agreements, pages of rules about lawn maintenance, mailbox colors, and noise restrictions. But buried deep within the fine print were clauses that made my stomach churn. Clauses granting the HOA sweeping powers over property usage, including the ability to seize land for community improvement projects. The language was deliberately vague, leaving room for interpretation and exploitation. I spent hours cross-referencing these agreements with city records, zoning laws, and past resolutions passed by the council. That's when I stumbled upon something that stopped me cold. Emails between Grayson and several city officials. Apparently, the parking lot wasn't just a random decision. It was part of a larger plan to rezone Brookwood Estates for commercial use. And here's the kicker. I'd unknowingly approved it months earlier during a routine council vote. My hands trembled as I stared at the screen. How could I have missed this? Had I been so distracted by my duties that I failed to see the bigger picture? Or worse, had someone deliberately buried the details to keep me in the dark? The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just about greed or power. It was personal. Grayson had played me. He'd used my position against me, manipulating the system to target Mom's home while I sat blissfully unaware. My own signature was on the paperwork that paved the way for her house to be demolished. Shame burned through me, but it quickly gave way to anger. Not just at Grayson, but at myself. I should have seen this coming. I should have asked more questions, demanded transparency, protected the people who trusted me to lead. Instead, I'd let them down, including my own mother. Determined to make things right, I dug deeper. What I found chilled me to the bone. Brookwood Estates HOA wasn't just a group of neighbors enforcing rules. It was a corporate entity masquerading as a community organization. Grayson himself was tied to multiple shady real estate deals, using HOAs to seize properties and flip them for profit. He preyed on vulnerable homeowners, intimidating them into selling or bulldozing their homes if they refused. One document in particular caught my attention, a list of properties marked for future development. Mom's house wasn't the only one targeted. Several others were flagged, including homes belonging to elderly residents and single parents. These weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a pattern, a scheme designed to enrich Grayson and his cronies at the expense of innocent people. By the time I finished reviewing everything, my head was spinning. The scale of the corruption was staggering, far beyond what I'd initially suspected. But knowing the truth wasn't enough. I needed proof, hard evidence that would hold up under scrutiny and expose Grayson for the fraud he was. That evening, I called an old friend from journalism school, Sarah, who now worked as an investigative reporter. She agreed to meet me at a quiet cafe downtown. Over coffee, I laid out everything I'd discovered, showing her the documents and emails I'd uncovered. "This is huge," Sarah said, her eyes wide with disbelief. "If we can verify this, it'll blow the lid off Brookwood Estates. But we need to be careful," I warned. "Grayson's got connections everywhere. If he finds out we're onto him, he'll bury us." Sarah nodded, understanding the stakes. "Leave it to me. I'll dig into his background, talk to former employees, interview other homeowners. We'll build a case strong enough to take him down." As we parted ways, I felt a flicker of hope for the first time in days. Grayson thought he was untouchable, hiding behind legal loopholes and polished smiles. But he underestimated one thing, the power of the truth, and once it came out, there'd be no turning back. For the first time since Mom's house was torn down, I felt like I was fighting back, not just for her, but for everyone who'd been wronged. Grayson had picked the wrong family to mess with. Now, it was my turn to strike. The following evening, I held a press conference outside the ruins of Mom's home. Reporters gathered quickly, their cameras flashing as I stood in front of what used to be her driveway. Behind me, Mom sat quietly on a folding chair, clutching her old photo album like it was a lifeline. Her presence said more than words ever could. This wasn't just about policies or property. It was about people. "Good evening," I began, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "Many of you have heard about what happened here. My mother's home, the place where I grew up, was demolished without warning by the Brookwood Estates Homeowners Association. They claimed it was for the greater good of the community. But let me ask you this. Is it really for the greater good when an elderly woman loses everything she owns?" The crowd fell silent, hanging on every word. I paused, letting the gravity of the situation sink in before continuing. "This isn't just about my family," I said, my tone firm but measured. "This is about accountability, about protecting vulnerable citizens from predatory practices disguised as progress. What happened to my mother isn't an isolated incident. It's part of a pattern of greed, intimidation, and abuse of power." I went on to explain what I'd uncovered. Grayson's shady real estate deals, the vague HOA agreements that robbed homeowners of their rights, and the rezoning scheme that turned residential neighborhoods into profit centers. Each revelation drew gasps from the audience, and soon Hashtags like hashtag justice for Brookwood and hashtag stop HOA bullying began trending online. But the most powerful moment came when neighbors who had stayed silent stepped forward. One man recounted how the HOA fined him into bankruptcy after he refused to sell this property. A single mother described being evicted because her child's tricycle violated aesthetic guidelines. Another resident revealed how they were threatened with legal action if they dared to speak out against the association. As each story unfolded, the picture became clearer. Brookwood Estates wasn't a community, it was a trap. And Grayson wasn't just a president, he was a predator. Despite the mounting pressure, Grayson refused to back down. In fact, he doubled down, issuing a statement accusing me of abusing my position to settle a personal vendetta. Mayor Thompson is using her authority to target Brookwood Estates unfairly, he declared in a televised interview. Her actions are politically motivated and lack merit. His arrogance only fueled the fire. By the next day, local news outlets were swamped with calls from outraged residents demanding answers. Even some city council members who had previously supported Grayson began distancing themselves, realizing the tide was turning. Meanwhile, Sarah worked tirelessly to gather evidence. She interviewed former HOA employees who spoke of Grayson's manipulative tactics, unearthing memos that outlined plans to seize specific properties under the guise of community improvement. One whistleblower even provided a recording of Grayson bragging about how easy it was to exploit elderly homeowners. With each new piece of evidence, the case against Grayson grew stronger. The final blow came when Sarah published an expose detailing his connections to shady developers and his history of targeting vulnerable homeowners. The article went viral overnight, sparking national outrage. By the time the city council convened for an emergency session 2 weeks later, public opinion had shifted dramatically. Protesters gathered outside City Hall, holding signs that read "Protect Our Homes" and "No More HOA Abuse." Inside, the atmosphere was tense, with reporters packed into the room and cameras rolling. Grayson arrived flanked by lawyers, looking smug despite the growing storm. But I could see cracks forming beneath his polished exterior. For the first time, he looked nervous. And he should have been. Because this time, justice wasn't going to wait. It was coming, and it was coming for him. The emergency city council session was unlike anything I'd ever seen. The room buzzed with tension, every seat filled to capacity. Reporters lined the walls, their cameras trained on the front where Grayson sat flanked by his team of expensive lawyers. He wore a tailored suit and an air of confidence, but there was a flicker of unease in his eyes. For all his bravado, he knew the tide had turned against him. This hearing will determine whether Brookwood Estates HOA has acted within legal and ethical boundaries, I announced, standing at the head of the table. My voice was steady, though my heart pounded in my chest. If not, consequences will follow. One by one, witnesses took the stand. Neighbors who had been too afraid to speak out before now shared their stories openly, emboldened by the growing movement for justice. A retired teacher recounted how the HOA fined her repeatedly for minor infractions until she could no longer afford to stay in her home. A young father described being forced to sell his property after months of harassment over a cracked driveway tile. Each testimony painted a damning picture of abuse and exploitation. Then it was Sarah's turn. She presented the evidence she'd gathered: emails between Grayson and city officials, memos outlining plans to seize specific properties, and recordings of him boasting about his tactics. The room fell silent as she played the audio clip. Grayson shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his face pale. When it was my turn to speak, I stood tall, looking directly at Grayson. "This isn't just about my mother's home," I began, my voice firm but tinged with emotion. "It's about accountability, about protecting people who can't protect themselves. What happened here is nothing short of theft, legalized theft enabled by loopholes and greed." I recounted everything: the vague agreements, the rezoning scheme, the demolished homes. I showed photos of Mom's house before and after the demolition, holding them up for everyone to see. "Does this look like progress?" I asked, pointing to the rubble. Does destroying someone's life serve the greater good? Grayson tried to defend himself, claiming he was simply following procedures and prioritizing the community's needs. But his arguments sounded hollow compared to the mountain of evidence stacked against him. Even his own lawyers seemed less confident as the hearing dragged on. Finally, the council deliberated behind closed doors. When they returned, their verdict was swift and decisive. The HOA's charter was revoked immediately, stripping Grayson of his authority. Furthermore, he was barred from holding any leadership position in the future, effectively ending his reign of manipulation. Cheers erupted in the room, and reporters scrambled to capture the moment. Grayson sat frozen, his polished facade crumbling around him. For once, he had no clever words, no slick smile to hide behind. Justice had caught up with him. As I left City Hall that evening, protesters outside cheered and applauded. Some even thanked me personally, sharing how the case had inspired them to stand up against similar injustices in their own neighborhoods. It was overwhelming and humbling. This victory wasn't mine alone. It belonged to everyone who had dared to fight back. But despite the triumph, I couldn't shake the sadness lingering in my heart. Revoking the HOA's charter wouldn't rebuild Mom's home or restore what we'd lost. All the fines, evictions, and demolitions couldn't be undone overnight. Healing would take time. Still, as I drove home that night, I allowed myself a small measure of hope. We had exposed the truth, dismantled a corrupt system, and sent a clear message. No one was above accountability, not even someone like Grayson. And while the scars would remain, they served as a reminder of why we fought in the first place. For the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of peace. The battle wasn't over, but we had won the war. And sometimes, that's enough. In the months that followed, Brookwood Estates began to transform, not physically, but in spirit. The demolition of Mom's home had left a scar on the neighborhood, but it also sparked something unexpected: unity. Neighbors who had once avoided each other now came together, determined to rebuild not just houses, but trust. With guidance from the city and input from residents, a new governing body was formed. This time, transparency and compassion were at its core. Mom's house became a symbol of this change. Using funds raised by the community and donations from supporters, we'd rebuilt her home brick by brick. It wasn't an exact replica of what she'd lost. Some things couldn't be replaced, but it was warm, welcoming, and filled with love. On the day we moved her back in, neighbors gathered to celebrate, bringing food, flowers, and stories of their own resilience. For the first time in a long while, I saw Mom smile genuinely, her eyes shining with gratitude and hope. Standing in the doorway of her newly constructed house, I felt a mix of emotions. Pride swelled within me as I looked around at the people who had stood by us through the darkest days. But there was also sorrow, a deep ache for everything we'd endured. Justice had been served, but it hadn't come without cost. Homes had been destroyed, lives disrupted, and trust shattered. Those wounds wouldn't heal overnight, but they reminded me why fighting for fairness mattered so much. One evening, as Mom and I sat on her porch watching the sunset, she turned to me with tears in her eyes. "I never thought I'd see this place again," she said softly. "But more than that, I never thought I'd see kindness like this. From strangers, from neighbors, even from you." Her words caught me off guard. "From me?" I asked, surprised. She nodded, smiling faintly. "You've always been busy, sweetheart. Always working, always trying to make the world better for everyone else. But this time, you fought for us. And that means more to me than anything." Her voice broke slightly, and I reached over to take her hand. "You're my family, Mom," I said simply. "Of course I fought for you." That moment stayed with me long after the sun dipped below the horizon. It wasn't just about winning against Grayson or exposing corruption. It was about standing up for the people who mattered most. Being mayor meant making tough decisions for the greater good, but sometimes leadership meant going to war for your loved ones. And in doing so, I realized I'd become a stronger person, not just for myself, but for my community. As weeks turned into months, the scars of Brookwood Estates slowly faded. New homes were built where others had been demolished, and families returned to streets that once felt hostile. Residents formed committees to ensure no one could abuse power again, creating systems of checks and balances that prioritized fairness over profit. The HOA's downfall became a lesson, not just for our town, but for neighboring communities grappling with similar issues. For me, the experience changed everything. I learned that being a leader isn't about having all the answers. It's about listening, learning, and taking action when it matters most. I also learned that justice isn't perfect. It doesn't erase pain or undo mistakes, but it gives people a chance to start over, to build something better. One afternoon, as I walked through the neighborhood, I noticed something remarkable. Where barren dirt patches once marked demolished homes, gardens now bloomed. Wildflowers sprouted along sidewalks, defying the rigid rules of the past. Children played freely in driveways, their laughter echoing through the air. It was chaotic, messy, and alive. In other words, real. Brookwood Estates wasn't perfect. Maybe it never would be. But it was ours. A place where people cared for one another, where vulnerability wasn't seen as weakness, and where standing together made all the difference. As I stood there, watching the life return to the neighborhood, I whispered a silent promise. To Mom, to myself, and to everyone who had fought alongside us. We'll keep building, keep fighting, because justice isn't just about tearing down what's wrong. It's about creating something right. And for the first time in a long time, I believed it.